Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. Just a note, dear listener, that this is the last episode of the season, but we will return in the new year with some amazing new conversations. Now on to today's episode. Tinkered Thinking is the pseudonym of the author of a collection of stories called White Mirror. The stories in White Mirror explore the implications of artificial intelligence and advances in computing, but are designed to be more optimistic than many science fiction stories many of us might be used to. Tinkered Thinking and I had a chance to explore the origins of these stories and his writing more broadly, as well as how he went from a kind of Luddism to thinking about our technological future. We talked about how to examine the ideas of the future and technological progress, societal blind spots in tech, AI's import and impact, his concern around AI doomers, and what is a future that he would want for us. This was a delightful and deeply philosophical conversation, and I had a great time speaking with Tinkered Thinking. Let's jump in. Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet. Great to be chatting with you.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure. This is exciting. Yeah, I really enjoyed your new book, White Mirror. I wanted to maybe just first begin by asking, what prompted you to write these stories, and either write the book or turn them into a book? What was kind of the story behind the stories?
Okay. Do you want the long version or the Reader's Digest?
I'll take the long version.
Okay. Just because it was quite an organic process. I never really, planned to end up at this spot. I was actually, years ago, I was quite a Luddite. I used a typewriter. I was very serious about my identity as a writer, and I was writing stories that were in a much different vein than what you find in White Mirror. And sort of, I started getting published in journals, like literary journals and whatnot. And I had this, question that came across my mind. I was like, all right, I'm starting to get good. It'll probably take me another 10 years of this kind of work ethic to get really good. I wonder what the world will look like in 10 years. I wonder if anyone actually has some reliable projections along the lines of this question. And that's when I sort of discovered Ray Kurzweil, and Tony Seba was actually a big one who had a huge influence on me. And I had a bit of a break with how I envisioned my future and the work that I was going to be doing, because I was like, oh my gosh, in 10 years, a computer is going to be able to write, maybe not exactly, but it's probably going to be able to write the book that I have in mind, because it's going to be able to learn at a geometric rate compared to me slowly getting really good over the course of another decade to put in another 10,000 hours or whatever. So I kind of tried to give up writing, which was a very sad, part of my life, to be honest. And I was like, I need to do something more useful. And I started teaching myself how to code. So I became a coder. And one of the exercises to get into that AI and Cursor and all of these AI coding tools was just to build a blog. So I built a blog with no intention of actually using it. But when I got to the part in the course where it's like, now you put in ipsum lorem into all of these, into your body paragraph or your body of the blog post and whatnot. When that part came about, I had already made a deal with myself to be like, all right, I really miss writing. I'm just going to give myself 20 minutes a day in the mornings, and that's it. That's all I get. And no editing, because I was an obsessive editor. And so by the time I got to that point in the blog, I was like, oh, I have 50 essays. I'll just plop that in there. And that was the, sort of accidental birth of tinkeredthinking.com, which now has, over 1,000 essays and 250-ish stories. And it was completely by accident. I just showed it to a friend who was like a coding mentor to me at the time. And he was like, oh, this is really neat. And then 2 weeks later, he texts me and he's like, hey, when are you going to post more? I keep going back to see if there's new material. And I was like, oh, maybe I should develop this. So I decided to develop that in a week before I was, going to launch my blog, which felt a little felt a little silly as a blog, but it felt, as launching a coding project from scratch. It was, it was kind of a big moment in my coding journey. But a week prior, I was like, 7 days or 7 essays a week nonfiction is kind of boring. Maybe I can spice it up, and I'll just challenge myself to write a short story once a week on Sundays. Because I was also reading Taleb at the time, and I really liked the way that he made a fictional version of himself with I think Nero. Or he's got a few characters in there that are fictional, but he uses them as these foils to get concepts across. And I was like, oh, I'll do that. I was also reading Seneca at the time, and Seneca's, Letters from a Stoic is written to a guy in southern Rome whose name was Lucilius. And I was like, oh, no one's really picked up that name for like literary sake, other than I believe Shakespeare uses it in one of his plays as a sailor.
Okay.
It gets in the Tempest or something like that.
Oh,
But
interesting.
it's tiny.
Yeah, yeah.
No one's used it. So I was like, oh, this is like unconquered territory in terms of names. So that's why I picked that, because I was reading Seneca, and I decided, I was like, all right, if I'm going to do this once a week, I really need to take some guardrails off. So I was like, he has to be timeless. He can exist at any time. So a lot of the sort of parables on the blog take place in the past. They take place in the present. And then the natural evolution was, oh, well, now he's going to be in the future. And suddenly I was writing sci-fi without any intention or sort of premeditated hunch that I would do that. I just started thinking about the extrapolations, the ramifications of current technology, and thinking about, oh, what's this going to look like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, that kind of thing. In the same way that I had started reading Ray Kurzweil and thinking, oh my gosh, a computer's going to be able to write my dream book by the time I get there. So it was really that sort of exercise. And because I'd kind of like given up on writing, I really didn't take this project too seriously, um, at all. I only took it seriously from the point of view of the discipline required to produce a piece of writing every day.
Sure.
And I did that for like 3 years solid. Um, it's tapered off now because, actually putting White Mirror together was sort of its own project. So
Right.
all of the daily effort that I was putting into the blog, shifted into, all right, I've got a book deal now, which totally didn't expect. And that became sort of the amount of bandwidth I had for tinkered thinking suddenly flipped to working on White Mirror. So yeah, that's sort of a basic primer for
No, that's great.
how I got there.
And when you worked on, by the time you started working on the book, like are all the stories from the blog? Are there ones that are new? I assume you kind of reworked some of these kinds of things. Like what was the process there?
Okay, yeah, I guess there's a second part to this which I didn't mention. I got on Twitter at the behest of a friend who kept encouraging me to get on there. He's like, "You need to do it. You need to do that." But I still had quite a bit of Luddite in me. I was like, "I don't want to do social media." Finally, did grew a little bit of a following. Self-published the Lucilius Parables Volume 1 and 2.
Okay.
The first one did like way better than I thought it would. And it was like a nice little business experiment, because my sort of threshold for success was if like 10 people who I don't know buy this, I'm going to label that as a success. And the first day I launched it, my phone was like blowing up with orders, and I was like,
That's amazing.
what is this? Um and then fast forward, Jim O'Shaughnessy of O'Shaughnessy Ventures put a contest out on Twitter. He's like, we want some White Mirror stories. You just have to describe the story in a tweet. And a friend sent this to me via DMs, and he was like, yo, so many of your stories are just a shoe-in fit here, like perfect dovetail. And so I responded. I was like, can I respond with a whole story, like a fully written story instead of just a description? Response was like, sure. It's like, can I respond with more than one? And they're like, sure. So I responded with 10 fully written short stories, and actually 9. And then later that day, I was thinking about it, and I had an idea. So I sat down and wrote a short story. which also fit into this. So I responded with that one too, which I wrote on that day, and that's the one that won, which was
Oh, that's so
kind of
funny.
funny. Which also made it into White Mirror.
Okay, that's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I won that contest. Jim had me on his podcast, which was like a ton of fun. And then about a month later, I was just thinking about it. I was like, you know what? I think I'll focus solely on this theme of story for until I've got like 50 stories, and then I'll just self-publish a themed collection. And so I whipped up, a terrible looking cover and posted that to Twitter. I was like, yeah, announcing that this was my plan. And in like a quarter of a second, Jim responded and he's like, I'll publish it. Which surprised me because, like, what do you mean you're gonna publish it? Like, you're not a publisher. Little did I know that he was creating O'Shaughnessy Ventures and Infinite Books.
Right.
And yeah, then I got to work with Dylan O'Sullivan, who was the editor, that was an absolutely incredible experience. And yeah, that's kind of how it took off. All sort of accidental and organic.
I feel like that is the way many stories are, but no, that's amazing. So, and you mentioned like that you initially had these like Luddite tendencies. Like, do you still consider yourself a Luddite at base, where it's like you've kind of had to learn these technologies and engage with these certain ideas because you just think the world is changing very, very rapidly, but at base, you still really would wish you didn't have to? Like, how do you kind of think about your own identity in terms of your relationship with technology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think of myself as a Luddite because at all. Like, I mean, if you use language, you're not a Luddite in my eyes because language is a technology.
Sure.
If you wear shoes, if you brush your teeth, um, there's so much technology that is essentially protocol to the human species, and because it's protocol, it's invisible to us, and so we don't label it as technology.
Yeah.
Most of quote unquote technology is this novel, half baked, sort of works, sometimes overly hyped, but has a lot of potential. That seems to be what people call like technology,
Yeah.
or if it has electricity running through it.
Right.
I think
No, I was going to say, so the computer scientist Alan Kay, he has his his tongue-in-cheek definition, which is what is technology? It's anything that was invented after you were born. And because like that's
Mm,
how a lot of people think about technology. But you're right, all these things like windows and pencils and like desks, these are all technologies. And like yeah, the
yeah.
alphabet. But they've been so integrated into our society that we don't think of them as that way.
Yeah, a great tiny little personal anecdote. When I kind of realized this, I was actually working on a tall ship, the Lady Washington, which is a 200-ton brig. And I remember, talk about being a Luddite. I was on a 17th century square sail brig, working as a bosun. And I remember we were sailing south along the coast of Oregon, and I'd woken up. It was my watch, and I was up on deck, and I was having a sip of coffee, and it was just so beautiful. It was silent, and this huge machine is just gliding through the water, and the sun is rising. And I had this strange thought that just came out of nowhere and hit me like a ton of bricks, which I was thinking about how ugly container ships are. And then I had the thought, well, this, meaning the ship I was on, this beautiful wooden sail ship, this led to that. This was part of the evolution that led to, this big, ugly, rusty tanker. And so I suddenly saw this not as like a static time to be nostalgic for. It was actually a step in a continual vector of, a movement of evolution towards a current thing that I didn't like for all sort of aesthetic purposes. And I realized that there was I was basically wearing some horse blinders that was very selective about how I would interpret and look at my environment.
Oh, that's so
So yeah, I don't think of myself as a
okay.
Luddite.
No, and it's super interesting, right? This like, right. And I think right, people have relationships and responses to different kinds of technology, and sometimes, right, the response, it is what it is. Then you can kind of examine some of those assumptions. But it also reminds me of the children's author Virginia Lee Burton. So she has a number of children's books. One of them is Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel. I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but it's about this guy who has a steam shovel, and then of course I think like the diesel shovels or like the newer ones are kind of coming, and and there's kind of this implication within the book that they're like more impersonal, and it just it's one of these things, right? Recognizing that we are on this technological continuum. Now, of course, how how we progress and how we innovate, those are still choices, and we have to kind of be deliberate about those kinds of things. But to kind of simply say, right, like no further, and like this is where we stop, kind of like it feels sometimes artificial. And yeah, we have to recognize that, or at least be open to how these things develop over time.
Yeah, the idea of choosing is something that I'm a little suspicious and nervous about because I'm not sure we have the capacity as a group to be very mindful about choosing one direction or another. Um, yeah, I think maybe there's some sort of psychohistory, big brain, um, how do you say that word? Colonal organism, um,
Yeah, I mean,
sort of
yeah,
invisible thinking that's going on that I'm not sure that we get too much of an input. I think we get some input, which is why,
right,
it's
and
good
right.
to.
So I think there's something to be said for like, I mean, the ability to steer a little bit. I mean, 'cause this is, I mean, I've talked about this before, but I mean, I I, I don't like thinking about progress or technological innovation simply as like something that like washes over us and just kind of happens
Mm,
to us. Like it it's made up of people's choices and individual actions. Now, right, there is that kind of like psychohistory kind of thing of like, oh, it's this big statistical aggregate, and so we like like our choices all matter, but in the same way, maybe I don't know, the individual atoms within or molecules within a gas matter for generating the pressure, like in a very some small way. But I still think that maybe as a society, we can, I'd like to think that we can choose the direction we might want to go, at least maybe at the margins.
okay, let me bounce a very practical, down to earth example at you.
Okay.
So I spend a lot of time thinking about language and how language is a technology, but it's also got an eerie similarity to a virus. Um, and we're wholly dependent on it. There are a few instances where a human was uh, grew up with in the absence of language, and the results of that are horrific. You basically get a feral animal. So our humanity really is embedded within our capacity, not just our capacity for language, but the necessity to have language as part of our upbringing. There's a whole set of, sort of culture is embedded into that. And it replicates, it moves from mind to mind. The mind is dependent on it. It is dependent on us. It can lay dormant like in a book, and then suddenly,
Yeah.
someone opens it
Right.
and it
Right.
comes to
Language
life.
can evolve. Right.
Yeah, it also evolves in ways that you can't control.
Correct.
Like you can't make up a word and have everyone adopt it. It just doesn't work. And yet words new words come about all the time, and it happens in this very sort of organic, unpredictable fashion. And so to bring this back to a larger conversation about technology, and it's like, oh, well, do I actually get to choose my next set of words? I mean, sort of. But if I were to ask you, can you please predict your next thought? It's
Yeah.
not possible to do because to predict that next thought is to actually have that thought.
Correct.
So there is some steering, but it's more like is more like you're dancing. There is some agency and control, but you're also beholden to a beat, a rhythm that is not something that you're necessarily in control of. Like you can't suddenly switch to a language that you don't know uh, in order to describe a concept that doesn't exist in a language that you do have. So then we can bridge into like the Sepper-Whorf
Yeah,
hypothesis and
yeah.
whatnot. But
No, well, I mean,
um,
but even related to that, I mean, going back to what you're saying of like you were reading like Ray Kurzweil and some of the other kinds of things, which got you to think about the direction of technology and AI. I mean, do you feel as if the trends you read about in those early days, does that like do you feel as if we are still inexorably on this path? Do you kind of caveat some of these directions? Like how do you think about um yeah, like the direction of society, especially when it comes to technological progress and AI development?
well, there does have to be a deliberate aspect to it. I mean, there's the fact that, the developments in space really stagnated
Yeah.
after, I guess the 70s. Everything started to sort of slide backwards. Like we all got to the moon and then we stopped going to the moon.
Right. Then we were kind of
And
like
then we
we were like stuck in low Earth orbit for several decades. Yeah.
yeah, then we had like a space shuttle and one space station, and now the space station is going to get deorbited. The space shuttle doesn't exist, and it was decaying. If it weren't for something like SpaceX to kind of kick humanity's ass into gear, um, we'd still just be decaying into the point where we didn't send anything into space other than at least not send any humans. Um, so I think there does, that's a good example of like, well, it doesn't necessarily progress automatically. I mean, maybe it does, and that's sort of like a blip, a natural dip due to noise. Like if you zoom up far enough, you don't see it anymore.
Sure. Right. Like depends like the time scale you're looking.
Mhm. But I think when you can boil it down to your own life and think about your own skill acquisition. It's like if you don't actively pursue a greater level of agency usually through skill acquisition, it's just not going to happen on its own. Like the books on the shelf don't read themselves. I think we've lulled ourselves into a kind of like, well, the TikTok scrolls on its own, but the books do not turn their own pages. So, um, yeah.
Yes. I mean, so when you think then about like the future, both, I mean, it can be future technologies, but again, like when I think about the future, like technology is one aspect. Like it's also like, it's not just gadgets. Like it's often like, how does it embedded in society and how that affects societal change? And there's all these different things. When you think about, yeah, like where things might be going, I mean, certainly in your stories, you talk about a lot of different scenarios. Like, are you, are you thinking about it as here are some likely ones, here are some less likely potential paths, here are ones I wish were actually going to happen? Is it more like here's some fun, interesting stories that I actually think are really unlikely, but they're fun to just think about? Like how do you think about the direction of the future, like with the big capital F?
So I think there's two answers there. There's answering that directly, and then there's like answering it in the context of the book.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't think they're exactly the same answer. For the book, I wrote like 56 stories, and then Dylan and I picked the most appropriate. First, it was 28, and then a few more got added, kind of thing. Um, and in that sense, writing those stories, I was really just having a lot of fun. I write first drafts at like crazy fast speeds, and it's really just it developed from the blog exercise of trying to get a finished piece of writing out every day. So it was really an exercise in the first draft, like how fast, how good can the first draft be? And so these stories were really the result of a bunch of casual curiosities about current technologies that people are talking about or that are getting developed. And so then when it came to putting a book together, you have to sort of shift from realistic, like, oh, which one should I put in, the things that are the most probable? No, you actually have to shift to like, all right, what is most effective for this book as like a unified piece of art? So that shifts the way that you start to think about filtering the stories. But to answer your question more directly, I think there's a bunch of big blind spots that I'm surprised don't get commented on. Like one, the next book that I'm working on is a novel. I'm about 12 chapters in, and it takes place in 2094, and the protagonist is a woman, and it deals with the idea of, let's say we crack anti-aging, which I follow this field quite closely just because I find it fascinating. More like tons of money is getting dumped into this, and the breakthroughs across the medical field are really starting to ramp up. I mean, a couple decades ago, it was like if one thing happened in the year that made the news, it was like, whoa, okay, cool. Now it's like every week something is yeah, multiple times a week something is popping up. You could probably just map the trend of the number of stories. You'll get an exponential curve, and it's like when it hits an asymptote, you're probably looking at something like biological immortality or anti-aging to some degree that is going to significantly expand the human health span and lifespan. So in regards to that technology or that set of technologies in particular, it's like, all right, well, now we can actually think about the fertility crisis a bit differently. If you have this huge portion of the population which is aging, and we actually figure out how to bring their age back down, potentially even into fertile years, the fertility crisis suddenly has a completely different set of math that you have to pour into it. Adjacent to that is, well, what is like an institution like marriage look like when till death do us part is potentially a long, long time. I think there's going to be a lot of situations where if this set of technologies does impact the population at large, there's going to be quite a few people who look at each other and like, we had a good run, but I think we're both thinking the same thing. And it's like, yeah, okay. They hug it out and they go their separate ways because, that's, and maybe that's blasphemous or sacrilege. But if you look at the history of marriage, as its own technology, it has evolved and it has much different reasons and incentives today than it did, even a few hundred years ago. So I like thinking about, I don't know, I've gotten off the question a little bit, but I like thinking about the sort of second and third order effects of technologies because it's like, oh, live for a couple hundred years, great. But it's like, all right, let's go beyond that and think about like, all right, what does that mean about like your family, your relationships, all that sort of stuff.
Right, and also not if it's just one person who's like amid like one immortal with everyone, but like if the entire society is like that, that's going to change how we think about a lot of things. Well, it's a really interesting example. I mean, are there other? And I think you described it initially as like a blind spot, like society's kind of blind spot of like they haven't either noticed some of these technological trajectories and thought through the implications, or just haven't thought through the implications. Are
Mhm.
there other blind spots that you feel are worth either
Yeah.
exploring or just like you've also just noticed them?
Well, I mean, we can look. I was thinking about this morning actually. Like you think about the dot-com bubble in the late 90s. It's like, well, the internet's not dead. So was that a bubble? I mean, it was a financial sort of hype bubble, but I mean, all of the hype about the internet was not misplaced. It's still not just a part of our lives, but it's its tendrils have just deepened to you know an extreme degree where it is necessary for almost every aspect of life. Was there a blind spot with regards to the fact that there was a crash in the late 90s because humans were simply impatient and they were like, "Oh, this is overhyped." And then now they're actually getting blind to the fact that their hype was correct on a different time scale,
Yeah, yeah,
you know? So I think about that today, in 2025, it appears like the LLMs might be plateauing. I've seen chatter of this. I kind of get that sense myself. I think that's potentially a blind spot because there's still so much to do with the current capacities of LLMs. It's absurd. Like if LLMs did not progress at all and remained as they are, I would still have projects for years to just churn through with current capabilities. So I think there is a disconnect. I think hype creates a blind spot for a whole bunch of things because it narrows focus on something and intensifies it at the exclusion of a whole bunch of secondary and third order effects, or adjacent aspects that extrapolations that people aren't considering.
And is that also related to just the fact that, and humans, for better or for worse, are really good at like adapting and like getting used to things that are like really, really new, like a moment ago. Like I think about and I don't think I've told this story on this podcast, but like when I've been interviewed elsewhere. So my grandfather, he read science fiction since like the modern dawn of the genre. He lived to the age of 99. He was a retired dentist. I think he read Dune when it was like serialized in a magazine. Like he like knew all the stuff. And so when
Wow.
when the iPhone first came out, I went with him and my father to the Apple store, and we're like checking it out. And we're playing with it. He's like, look, he looks at it at one point and goes, this is it. Like, this is the object I've been reading about all these years. And like, we went from that moment to like complaining about battery life and camera resolution, like so rapidly. And so, which I guess in one sense is good that humans are like, we get used to things that are really wildly different. But, but you're right. Like, we forget then how impressive these things are, especially when it comes to AI, right? Even if these things plateau, that doesn't therefore mean that they're not impressive still, and like that there's still so many things we can be doing. And so yeah, it's a weird situation, like the way humans adapt and just don't like take things for granted, for better or for worse.
Yeah, and I think this plugs into the nostalgia concept quite a bit. When people are romanticizing some past age, and they're like, "Oh, things were better back then," or like, "Oh, the good old days." I think what's going on there is, and I saw this tweet the other day. There's something like, when people are nostalgic, they're actually just missing a time when they were younger and had more energy. And
Right.
it's like, or then I
Right. Or more
kind of,
energy, or like, or when they were younger and like their needs were taken care of by their parents. And it's like they didn't have as many responsibilities. Like, yeah, it just, right. Which is not necessarily meaning that society was better. It was just things were better for you because you were a little kid or whatever it was.
or on top of that, when you were a kid, you were far more curious about the world. You're probably way more likely to experience joy at even the dumbest, simplest little things. Um,
And
and
you had huge amounts of unstructured time to just go deep on various things and
yeah,
learn about stuff in a way that,
mhm.
and yeah, when you're an adult and have lots of responsibilities, it's sometimes a little bit tougher.
Yeah, and the rigmarole of meeting those responsibilities also clouds out or crowds out this need to maintain the the mechanics of curiosity and joy. If you don't take care of those in yourself, they really degrade over time, and then you end up a miserable rat in a wheel kind of thing. But the point is, and I mentioned Seneca earlier, and reading that book was hugely helpful. You can be a very happy rat in a wheel, even if you don't like the wheel. um, so yeah, just to plug into this idea that humans can become inured. I was listening to I think it was the CEO of Zipline, which is a drone company, and they're working in Rwanda to ferry blood and whatnot out to villages, very far from, yeah, basically in remote areas, and they're saving tons of lives, which they didn't actually expect, which is interesting. But he told this story. He's like, the awe that people experience from the future suddenly being now is about 7 days, because when he first trialed this in Rwanda, the people were just blown away of like, what just happened? Like, this little thing just flew out from the horizon and dropped off a bag of blood and then left. And then he was like, yeah, 7 days later, I was with them again, and they turned to me and was like, it's 30 seconds late.
Yeah.
It's like,
Right. And this,
what? Really?
or like, yeah, and the first time like when I used like a Waymo, like that
Mhm,
was, it was amazing. But like within like 30 to 60 seconds, you're like, okay, this is just like a really smooth Uber ride. And like, it just,
mhm.
and like, it becomes mundane. And you like try to keep, like, you try to maintain and keep that like sense of wonder and excitement of like, oh my God, I'm living in the future. But I think in some ways it's not, you have to balance it. Like if you're constantly overwhelmed by things being new, that's probably also not good either. And so how do you, right, it's like one of these weird things of like, how do you balance delighting in like all the new that is around you, feeling excitement, feeling joy and wonder, while at the same time just being able to like not be overwhelmed by it and be able to actually kind of examine it critically.
I mean, that's definitely the challenge of the age.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for this, but it's just an interesting thing. Like we are really good at adapting, and and that sometimes can be very powerful, but it also then shields us from some of these kinds of developments. So related to these developments, so like in your stories, AI and computing more broadly, I would say, like those are kind of the major, I don't know, preoccupations of a lot of the stories. They're kind of like driving some of the developments. Um, yeah, how do you like? Do you feel that these are going to be? I mean, you mentioned certain things around like LLMs might be stagnating in terms of like that framework. But more broadly, if AI continues apace, like, do you really feel like they are going to be driving so much of technological change and societal change that like everything really is almost like relegated to this kind of afterthought or footnote?
I think a lot of the stories, or majority of the stories in White Mirror, centered on AI in that way, simply because it was more top of mind for me at the moment. Like if I compare it to the novel that I'm writing now, AI plays a big part, but it's more of a background role. It's not central at all. And the focus of that book is really the human experience. So, for example, in White Mirror, like Lucilius is a pretty flat character, and that's somewhat intentional. He kind of has to be in order to function in so many varying situations. You can't have someone who's uh, if you took like a curmudgeon, like a very neurotic, like low agreeableness, and put them in all of those situations, you wouldn't get White Mirror.
You would get
You'd
something
get
else that could be very. It's,
yeah,
yeah, it's like,
yeah.
um,
It would probably be funny,
yeah. I'm
but
picturing, yeah, like Statler and Waldorf, but like in the AI future, which that could be a story.
that could be great. Just not what I was trying to do there.
Completely.
Um, but yeah, again, like him being a flat character is sort of an art, an artifact of the constraints and the freedoms that I was giving myself, in order to write so many stories, because I was going for quantity, over quality, on the principle that quantity will eventually give you quality by default, just from law of large numbers. And there's a nice little analogy about the great composers that I could get into, but the point is that they just did a lot
We just
more
do a
than
lot. Yeah, you're gonna get a lot of good
mediocre
things, a
ones.
lot of bad things. Right. You need to do a
Yeah,
lot in order to get.
exactly.
Uh,
And at the end of the day, you'll at least have something on the page, as opposed to like one work to death paragraph that isn't even very good.
right.
So to go back to your question, my main sort of creative focus now is sort of the inverse of that, where I'm really focusing on the human aspect of it, and the AI part is plays much more of a background and infrastructure role. But I think there's still so much work to do with LLMs. I mean, just from a coding standpoint, the things that you can build is insane. Now, if coding eventually fades to nothing because you can essentially generate UIs and entire backends on the fly in the same way that an LLM generates, a paragraph and a story, blah, blah, blah. Then everything that I've just said about how much work there is, that will simply just get faster, because then you don't need a preliminary or base level of coding to actually get something into production and working. And this whole vibe coding thing, you a normal person, or a person who's never done any coding, can't really build a complex app, get it into production, and then sell that on the app store. I mean, they could if they're incredibly stubborn in a positive way,
Yeah.
aka determined, but that means they probably could have done it without AI in that case. But right now, it really does require, in order to be dangerous with coding and plus AI, you really do need some experience in order to figure out when it goes off the rails, how it's gone off the rails, and then once it's working really well in on local, in order to push that into production. Um, so there is still a ton to do. I don't think LLMs are going to be the end state of AI. I think there's going to be more breakthroughs, which are by default impossible to predict, that where LLMs are going to be a part of it. there was this great book. I wish I could remember the name, but it basically made the argument that if you took the neocortex, each basically like, micrometer by micrometer column of the neocortex is its own little sort of, LLM or neural net. And essentially we have 100,000 LLMs in our brain, and they don't all do the same thing. Obviously, they all do different things, and it's really, our brain is really an orchestration of all of those different neural nets. So right now we have Claude, Gemini, Grok, and GPT. We have like five. um, and they all kind of do the same thing. But imagine if we had 100,000 that were all incredibly specialized in different things, and then we had a completely different architecture that orchestrated all of those. So, for example, I shudder at the thought of someone, and maybe it's bad to put this idea out into the world, but I shudder at the thought of someone creating a limbic system and plugging that into an LLM, because people worry, like Yukowski worries about our AI killing us all, maybe by sort of accident, because it's got some other goal that doesn't include us, or it's malicious, like the Terminator or something. In order to have those goals, like, I think a limbic system is required for a lot of types of goals. Um, so I and the limbic system is not a very smart thing in a modern world. It's smart for like a dog eats dog, um, Thoreau's trip to Maine experience of like the real wild, dinosaur eats dinosaur kind of thing. But I don't think the limbic system is particularly helpful for modern living. So um, that, but it is an example of a sort of orchestration that would be required to bring a ton of different types of fine-tuned or specialized LLMs into an orchestrated, whole. I think maybe something like that might happen, but again, it's impossible to predict.
How do you think about, like, not necessarily the impact of AI, but like how, like like the importance of AI and kind of like the mind share of, especially like the world of like tech in Silicon Valley? I mean, like you mentioned, and we were talking about earlier, like the stories of White Mirror, they are primarily related to AI because that was very much top of mind. But you said that's not necessarily like it's not the only thing, and then everything else is like to the exclusion of that. You mentioned like the novel you're working on is much more longevity, even though AI is kind of sprinkled throughout in terms of the world. Do you think that there is like a mismatch in like Silicon Valley in terms of how much people think about AI versus how much they should be thinking about it? Like, is it accorded the proper amount of concern or attention, or is it also like a little out of whack there?
I mean, there still is a ton to do with it. So the people who are aware of that are using it for to get a lot of things done that other people who are like, whatever, aren't going to get done. I mean, I have some friends who basically don't interact with AI at all, and then I've used sort of aspects of their life where it's like, oh man, if they were using AI, they could probably fast track a path to a solution for this like much faster. And then I might sort of demo something like I was at my sister's house, and she needed a recipe for something, and I just like whipped out ChatGPT and spoke to it, and it gave us a recipe, and she was like, "What is that?" I was like, I've told you about this before. Don't give me that." Um, so I don't know about Silicon Valley in particular. It seems like a lot of Silicon Valley is scrambling to get rich fast
Okay.
and use technology to do it. And that being said, there are a lot of genuine players who are trying to build things that are good, meaningful, and impactful. But there definitely is quite a bit of a who can the whole Forbes under 40, Forbes under 30 thing, and how that's such a great predictor for if someone's going to go to jail in the next 10 years. Like, um anything that's hyped is going to attract flies and bees alike. So I think, is there over concentration on LLMs? In some respects, yeah. Is there under concentration on it in some respects? Yeah. It kind of depends on, I guess, who we're talking about.
Okay, and I guess do you al- do you also feel that maybe there's too much of a focus, or maybe not a focus enough of like, and given that your story is to kind of talk about like long term future and things around like singularity and super intelligence, um, the almost like existential impact of AI, and how it will kind of like rejigger all of society, um, or yeah, create these things like I create a singularity, whether it's like the Ray Kurzweil singularity or just like a point beyond which it's like hard to imagine the future. Do you think the level of focus on those aspects is is right? Is it, are they not focusing on it enough? Should we be focusing on it more or
The
less?
doomers do concern me
Okay.
because I think there is an aspect of hyperstition. There's so I in my experience, there's so much of human life that is counterintuitive in a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of way where, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. One of my favorite words is iatrogenic, which means that the diagnosis or treatment of a condition actually makes things worse or creates the disease. So, if you spend your whole time being anxious about the fact that you're not going to have a good life, you're going to be anxious for that whole life, and that's not going to be a good life. So I think that tiny little sort of silly personal example actually does extrapolate to populations. Like if we're all super focused on a negative future, the chances we're gonna have a great future are probably less. um, and I think that was a that's sort of like the entire core and point of White Mirror. It's like, man, I really liked Black Mirror because there's good execution, there's interesting ideas, but like, holy mother of God, I am tired of everything being so dismal and pessimistic. And there's actually quite a few Black Mirror episodes where it's like, there was no reason for that to be like dark and depressing. Like, that was an awesome concept. And they just like injected it with tar just to
Like
make it
made
bad.
it like the worst version of it possible.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this maybe ties into the degradation of progress that was mentioning earlier when the example was this our reach into space was starting to degrade, and we got all of that's when sci-fi started to turn dystopian, and then you got Terminator and Jurassic. I recently watched Jurassic Park, which was incredible in terms of how predictive it was of all of these tiny little trends. Like there's even this part where the kid gripes at the fact that he's being called a computer nerd, and he says, "No, I'm a hacker." And I was like, "Wow, that was actually really like prescient for what 1992 or whatever that was." So I think the stories we tell ourselves end up becoming in some way reality. So we got to be careful about the stories that we tell ourselves. Otherwise, we're not going to end up in a great place. So I do worry about the doomers. I think being overly optimistic, like so rosy over optimistic that you're wearing a different type of horse blinders is not good either. I think being mindful of what could go wrong is important, but to focus exclusively on it to the point where you have a title like "If anyone builds it, everyone dies." Like, okay, like so little hyperbolic. Um,
And certainly
you know,
a
th-
very single-minded focus. Yeah.
yeah, I mean a book of that title could have been written right before the Manhattan Project was completed. If anyone builds a nuclear weapons, everyone dies. I mean, that's a fair argument. Here we are, how many decades later, and a disgusting number of nuclear weapons on the planet, and we're still here. So we have a shocking capacity to continue on and progress while in the midst of a capacity to annihilate our entire species.
Right.
So, um,
We're very good at muddling through.
yeah.
Yeah. And so in White Mirror, you mentioned like a number of different kind of scenarios and stories that are kind of these more not maybe not like naively optimistic, but more like positive futures. And if you had to, and this is a tall task, but like if you had to kind of condense or compress kind of like your like the kind of future you want or the kind of story like the larger story we should be telling ourselves as a society, like what is that future that you kind of envision for yourself or for us?
Well, maybe it's because I'm writing a novel on it that it's so on my mind, but I think I think the human lifespan being as short as it does really constrains what we think our lives can be. Certainly it constrains our opportunities. Like you only have so much time to do anything. And then what age you are really does have like a big impact on what sort of opportunities you're going to, you know, what sort of responsibilities you have. You basically your life basically gets like whittled down to a particular shape due to experience, responsibilities, and all of these things. And it's really a narrowing of future possibility. I mean, that's true at like pretty much all moments. Like any decision that you make, by default, um, obliterates all of the other possible things that you do. But it happens on another level with regards to the structure of your life. And a lot of these things are dependent on the fact that we have baked into our culture and our psychology this idea that you know human life is you're really lucky if you get like 80 useful years, and maybe that's even putting it too far because retirement's like 65. So maybe you get like between 20 and 65, you get that portion, and that's actually very small. And if we can actually use AI and all of these different technologies to unlock what's going on biologically and like greatly extend the time, simply the time that we have, I think that could have a drastic positive impact in terms of the priorities that we pursue. So going back to, you know, my little, the shade I threw at Silicon Valley, it's like, well, everyone's trying to get rich fast because we don't have that much time. But if you had like 1,000 years, would it be that much of like a desperate priority, or would your focus change? Would your priorities be more informed, more like what we would regard as a wise person? The wise person is someone who plants a tree with the idea that they won't be able to enjoy the shade of it. Well, what if you actually do get to enjoy the shade under that tree along with, whatever descendant you plan for also gets to do that? So I would love for us to have a lot more time. I think there are just so many conversations that just don't happen because we don't have enough time. Like you said earlier, all of these great things about childhood that just get like brutally stripped from adult life, like the time to unstructured play, the time to engage in curiosity, like all of these things really get whittled down, and it has to do with this time constraint. Whereas if for example we were to use AI to completely automate, food production and housing, house construction, and be able to orchestrate all of that. Because I mean, there's technically no reason why food can't be free. Like the sun is free. It comes out every day and it grows the plants. The plants are already like a very well developed technology. It's just a matter of planting, pruning, harvesting, and then transport. Like that that's all of it, and all of that can be automated. And that's a sort of another topic. I think that the price of food will eventually trend to zero, which will be great. Back to the main thing. I really hope that we all get a lot more time, because I think there's just too much about the human experience that's compressed into our current lives, and I think a lot of that compression creates a lot of pain and suffering and regret. And I think a lot of people in their last decades spend all their time thinking about the past and about what might have been, what could have been, and there's no longer any opportunity to look forward and explore possibilities based on what they've learned over their lifetime. So if we could just extend that, I mean, I think that would be an amazing future.
No, I love that. That is a fun and optimistic vision. Um, on that note, that might actually be a perfect place to end. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time to chat. This has been amazing.
Yeah, my pleasure. This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for having me.